It was a grey morning in late March of 1905 in the borough of Williston, northwest London. A damp Edwardian fog clung to the brick terraces of Harleston, and the smell of coal smoke hung heavy over the rooftops. Somewhere a furniture van rattled down Milton Avenue, and inside a storage depository near Wormwood Scrubs, a constable's crowbar was about to bite into the lid of a tin trunk. The ledger said it held only chemicals and books. It did not. Tell me what kind of man seals his wife and his children behind boric acid glue and then walks away whistling, calling himself a widower. Beatrice Devereux was 30 years old. She had a loving manor, 2-year-old twin boys she nursed through constant illness, and a husband she had once believed was destined for greatness. She would never see the spring of 1905 in. Within hours of a single quiet evening that January, she and both infants lay dead without a mark of violence upon them. And the man responsible was no stranger lurking in an alley. He was the father of those children. He was, the press would soon scream, the architect of the tin trunk tragedy. Now, before we go any further into the shadows, this is soil of crime, and this channel is built for the bravest souls among you. The true mystery seekers, the ones who don't look away. What you are about to hear is a story history very nearly buried inside a sealed box. So I'll ask you plainly, do you have the courage to follow it all the way to the gallows? If you do, subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Join the investigation. These victims deserve witnesses. Now let us begin. To understand this crime, you have to understand the world that produced it. Edwardian London was a city of relentless social performance. Respectability was currency, and a clean collar could buy a man trust he had not earned. The chemist's trade sat in a peculiar place within this hierarchy, neither gentleman nor laborer, but a man with a white apron and a dangerous education. For the laws governing poisons were astonishingly loose. Arsenic, morphine, chloroform, antimony all could be obtained by those who knew the trade, logged in a register that few ever truly scrutinized. And in a chemist's hands, the line between healer and killer was only ever as thick as a man's conscience. Williston itself was booming, its population exploding from a few thousand to over 100,000 in barely 60 years, swelling with families chasing cheap rents and respectable addresses they could not quite afford. It was, in short, the perfect place to disappear into. Arthur Devereux was around 34 years old, a chemist's assistant by trade and a fantasist by temperament. Those who knew him in the Midlands in Malvern Link, where he passed himself off as a popular local dentist, and in Worcester's Arboretum district, remembered a flash, smooth-talking operator with an engaging personality. He wheedled his way into society circles far above his humble station, styling himself, absurdly, as a Yankee millionaire. But behind the respectable Edwardian facade was a man who was, by 1905, as good as bankrupt. Here is the thing you must grasp about Arthur Devereux. He was, emotionally, something of a child. He had married because his wife was pretty and feminine. The practical machinery of marriage, the rent, the doctor's bills, the squalling infants, never seemed to occur to him until it was crushing him. He daydreamed of escape the way other men daydream of fortune. Let me take you back to where it began, because Beatrice deserves that. One warm summer day in 1898, a pretty young woman named Beatrice Gregory was strolling through Alexandra Park in Hastings on holiday with her mother when she fell into conversation with a neatly dressed young chemist's assistant. His name was Arthur Devereux. The holiday atmosphere lent itself to romance, and she saw him every evening for the rest of her stay. Her mother, Ellen Gregory, liked him too at first. Arthur seemed different, imaginative, ambitious. When he spoke of the future, it sounded marvelous. When he proposed, Beatrice accepted at once, and they married not long after. She was, by every account, kind and hopeful, a woman who wanted nothing grander than a home, a husband who loved her and children to raise. By 1905 she was 30, undernourished, exhausted, and devoted to 3 little boys. She had no idea that the gentle, dreaming man she married had begun, quietly, to imagine a world without her in it. And then there were the children. The eldest was Stanley, 6 years old, healthy, bright, his father's open favorite. Arthur adored that boy with a fierceness that, in hindsight, is almost unbearable to contemplate. Then came the twins, Lawrence and Evelyn, just 2 years old. Now I want you to really picture this. These were not robust, thriving infants. The records describe them as sickly, rickety, frail little boys who needed constant care and constant medicine, the very thing that drained the family's meagre purse. To a loving father, they would have been a reason to work harder. To Arthur Devereux, they became, in the cold arithmetic of his fantasy, an obstacle. His affections, the record tells us plainly, were already fully engaged with Stanley. For the twins he felt no interest at all. And it is in that absence of feeling that the horror takes root. The family had moved from Worcester down to London some 2 years before, eventually settling into a rented house on Milton Avenue in Harleston. Money was always short. Arthur's wages as a chemist's assistant were poor, and 3 children, 2 of them perpetually ill, stretched them past breaking. Let's be honest for a second. Poverty alone does not make a murderer. Thousands of Edwardian families lived on less and held together through love and grit. But Arthur was not made of grit. He was an embittered man who had come to believe his wife had trapped him. He spent more and more time cuddling Stanley and brooding on how easy, how light, how free life would be without Beatrice and the twins. And then, in January of 1905, he stopped daydreaming, and he began to plan. Here is the detail that, for me, is the most chilling thing in the entire case. On the 22nd of January 1905, Arthur Devereux answered a newspaper advertisement for a chemist's assistant position up in Hull. His reply came in the form of a telegram, and it read, "Will a widower with 1 child, aged 6. Suit? A widower. 1 child." Read those words again, and let them settle. At the moment he wrote them, Beatrice was alive. Lawrence was alive. Evelyn was alive. All 3 were breathing, sleeping, eating under his roof. He had already mentally buried them. Around the same time he made other quiet preparations. He asked his landlord whether he might take over the flat below when its tenants left more room to work, and he brought home a large tin trunk. If only someone had asked why. What makes Arthur Devereux so unsettling is that he never abandoned his performance, not even at the end. To the wider world, he was simply a respectable chemist whose unfortunate wife had taken ill. He let it be understood, when convenient, that Beatrice was delicate, nervous, melancholic, prone to low spirits. This was the foundation he was laying. Because a depressed, fragile woman, you see, might do something desperate. He was, even before the deaths, quietly building the alibi he would later try to hide behind. That is the mark of cold premeditation, not rage, not a moment's madness, but a story constructed in advance, brick by careful brick, by a man who already knew what he intended to do. It was on or about the 28th of January 1905, in the house on Milton Avenue. The exact sequence we can never fully know, and I will not pretend otherwise, but the medical and circumstantial evidence tells a grimly consistent tale. Devereux brought home a bottle of morphine, and there was chloroform too from his chemical stock. Now you have to understand how the murder was managed. He did not need force. He was a chemist. He needed only trust. He induced Beatrice to swallow a quantity of the poison, quite possibly by telling her it was medicine for a cough, the most domestic of small kindnesses, and then he administered it to the twins, those two sickly boys, in the same way. Cough medicine. The bedtime spoonful a frail child takes without question. Crucially, throughout this, 6-year-old Stanley was kept safely out of the house, sent off to play in the street. The favorite was protected. The others were not. By the next morning, Beatrice, Lawrence, and Evelyn were all dead. Morphine and chloroform are merciful. In the cruel relative sense the word can carry, they are quick and quiet poisons. There were no convulsions written across the bodies, no wounds, no struggle the world could later read. Professor Pepper, the Home Office pathologist who would examine them, found no outward sign of physical violence on any of the three. The divisional police surgeon concluded the deaths had been caused by a volatile, quick-acting poison. And that was precisely the point. Devereux did not want a death that screamed. He wanted a death that whispered, that could pass, on paper, for something else entirely. A delicate wife, a private tragedy, a closed door. He had chosen his weapons not for cruelty, but for deniability. And in that calculation lies the coldest thing about him. Pause here with me for just a moment, because the story is about to turn truly chilling. I'm curious, where are you listening from today? Whatever the hour, day or night, this horror seems to transcend time. Drop your city in the comments and subscribe, because what this man did next to the bodies of his own wife and children is what gave this case its terrible name. Now let's continue with what happened next. This is where Arthur Devereux passed from murderer into something that has haunted the case for over a century. He had been inspired, the records suggest, by another North London killer, George Crossman, a bigamist who only the year before and barely a mile away had hidden a murdered wife in a cement-filled trunk. Devereux was determined to be smarter. So he took the large tin trunk he had brought home, and into it he placed the bodies of Beatrice and the twins. Then he went to work like the chemist he was. The trunk was professionally strapped, padlocked, and screwed down. And then this is the detail that gives the whole case its awful clinical signature. He sealed it hermetically, using a fungi-suppressing boric acid glue to halt decomposition and, crucially, to suppress the telltale smell. The police surgeon would later state that the trunk could have sat for years without ever betraying what lay inside. He had not merely hidden his family, he had embalmed them in a box. With the trunk sealed, Devereux arranged for a removals firm, Bannisters, to cart it away to a furniture storage depository near Wormwood Scrubs. The ledger entry, in his own careful hand, recorded the contents as chemicals and books. Then he sold off the family's furniture, emptied the house on Milton Avenue, took his beloved Stanley by the hand, and vanished. He moved on, ready to begin his new life, the life he had telegraphed weeks earlier as a respectable widower with one fine son. And here is the question that still chills criminologists today. Did he truly believe he would get away with it? A man of any sense knows that a trunk containing 3 bodies will, sooner or later, attract attention. A man of any sense knows that a grieving mother does not simply forget her daughter. But Arthur Devereux did not live in a world of sense. He lived in a world of wishful thinking, where the inconvenient could be made to simply disappear, like a lady in a conjurer's cabinet. But he had not reckoned with Ellen Gregory. And this, in a story so full of darkness, is where we find our single point of light. Beatrice's mother had not heard from her daughter since the middle of January, no letter, no word, nothing, that silence was unnatural, and a mother's instinct knew it. When she called at the house in Harleston, she found it empty, the furniture gone. When she finally managed to get a letter forwarded to Arthur, his reply was evasive and strange. Beatrice, he wrote, had gone away on holiday, and he would prefer that her mother not attempt to contact her. Now you tell me what grieving relative accepts that? Ellen Gregory did not. Her intuition told her the worst had happened, and rather than weep, she investigated. She was, for all intents and purposes, the detective in this case before any detective arrived. Ellen Gregory did what the authorities had not yet thought to do. She tracked down the neighbor who had seen the furniture van. She traced that van to the removals firm, Bannister's, and she followed the trail to the storage depository near Wormwood Scrubs, where she learned that a single heavy trunk had been deposited among her daughter's belongings, a trunk her daughter had never owned. She pressed and pressed until she obtained the authority to have it opened. Think of the courage in that an ordinary Edwardian woman, with no power and no badge, refusing to be soothed by a clever son-in-law's lies, demanding that a sealed box be broken open, because she knew in her bones what her silence meant. Without Ellen Gregory, it is entirely possible that Arthur Devereux's hermetically sealed trunk would have done exactly what he intended, and 3 murders would have vanished from history. And so we return to that grey morning in late March 1905. At the depository near Wormwood Scrubs, a local police sergeant, at Ellen Gregory's insistence, set his crowbar to the lid. The strapping was cut, the padlock forced, the screws drawn out, and as the boric acid seal gave way, the truth of the tin trunk tragedy was laid bare. The bodies of Beatrice Moore Devereux, 30 years old, and her twin sons, Laurence and Evelyn, 2 years old, preserved and folded into the dark. I will spare you the gratuitous particulars, out of respect for the dead, but I ask you to hold this image instead, a mother who would not stop asking questions, standing over the box that held everything she had loved, her worst fear made real. The newspapers had their sensation by the next morning. The hunt for Arthur Devereux had begun. The forensic work that followed sat right at the frontier of what Edwardian science could do. The divisional police surgeon, assisted by the eminent Home Office pathologist Professor Augustus Pepper, a name that would loom large in British forensic history, examined all 3 bodies. They found no wounds, no fractures, no marks of strangulation. The cause was a volatile, quick-acting poison. Now, in 1905, toxicology was advancing but still limited. Pinning an exact dose of morphine in decomposed tissue was no simple matter. Yet the circumstantial architecture was overwhelming. The trunk, the boric acid glue, a chemist's trick, the sold furniture, the flight, and above all, the trail of a man who had access to precisely these poisons and the precise knowledge to deploy them. The science alone might have left room for doubt. But the science did not stand alone. Inspector Pollard was the man who took charge of the hunt, and he proved methodical. He reasoned that Devereux was a chemist's assistant who would seek similar work and who would be traveling with a 6-year-old boy. So Pollard ordered a nationwide check of chemists who had recently engaged a new assistant arriving with a young son. The net closed quickly. Devereux had fled to Coventry, found lodgings, and taken work with a local chemist, still playing the widower. When the police came for him, he blurted out a sentence that would help hang him. "You're making a mistake. I don't know anything about a tin trunk." And there it was. Because Pollard in that moment had said nothing whatsoever about a tin trunk. An innocent man does not deny a thing he has not been accused of. Arthur Devereux had just confessed without meaning to. He was taken back to London and charged. The press, already feasting on the tin trunk tragedy, whipped public feeling into a fury. When Devereux was brought before the court in the preliminary proceedings, he was reported to have looked around and noticed the newspaper artists sketching him, and, ever the performer, composed himself accordingly. Here was a man facing the deaths of his wife and infant sons, conscious to the last of how he appeared in print. The story he settled on, and would cling to until the end, was this. Beatrice had been morbidly depressed. She had poisoned the twins, and then taken her own life with poisons from his stock, and he, finding the dreadful scene, had panicked, concealed the bodies, and fled in terror of being blamed. It was not an impossible story. But it had one fatal flaw, and the prosecution knew exactly where to find it. The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in the closing days of July 1905, before judge and a packed gallery. Arthur Devereux, indicted for the willful murder of Beatrice Ellen Moore Devereux, pleaded not guilty. Among the witnesses called was his own mother, Julia Maria Devereux, and Ellen Gregory, the mother-in-law whose relentless suspicion had cracked the case open. The defense leaned on the only door left standing, that this was suicide and infanticide by a depressed woman, not murder by her husband. The prosecution, led by Mr. Matthews, dismantled it methodically. And then they produced the telegram. Will a widower with one child, aged 6, suit? Dated the 22nd of January, days before Beatrice and the twins drew their last breaths. How, the prosecution asked, could a man grieving an unforeseen tragedy have advertised himself as a widower while his wife yet lived? There was no answer. There could be no answer. The defense's entire edifice rested on Beatrice having killed herself in a fit of despair Devereux could not have predicted, yet here, in his own words, was proof he had been counting on her death for over a week. The case, despite its grim subject, did not take long. After the day's evidence, the matter went to the jury, and the jury, faced with the telegram, the trunk, the boric acid seal, the sold furniture, the flight to Coventry, and that damning unprompted denial, did not labor over it. They returned in roughly 10 minutes. Guilty, the verdict echoed through that packed courtroom, and the sentence followed as it must in 1905 for willful murder, death by hanging. Devereux, who had fully expected to talk his way free, who had built his whole life on the belief that a smooth tongue could rearrange reality, seems to have been genuinely stunned that the machinery of justice did not bend to his story. The verdict still echoes through history. 10 minutes, that is all it took a jury to see through a lie that had cost 3 innocent lives. If this story has moved you, take a moment now to subscribe to Soil of Crime and share your thoughts in the comments below. Justice, then. Remembrance now. Because somewhere out there, the names Beatrice, Lawrence, and Evelyn still deserve to be spoken aloud. Let's see this through to the end. In the statutory 3 weeks between sentence and execution, something revealing happened, or rather, something revealing failed to happen. Arthur Devereux expressed no anguish for Beatrice, none for the twins. His one consuming concern, recorded by those who attended him, was the future welfare of his surviving son Stanley. He even sat and jotted down a list of every address he had lived at since 1898 Middle Street in Worcester, Richmond Road in Malvern Link, and the rest as though tidying his accounts. On the 15th of August 1905, at Pentonville Prison, Arthur Devereux walked to the gallows seemingly resigned, restive only about the boy he was leaving behind. He was executed without incident by the hangman Henry Pierrepoint, assisted by John Ellis. The performer's final scene was a quiet one. The Home Secretary had declined to intervene. The law took its course. And what of those left behind? Stanley, the favored son, the child for whom his father had murdered the rest of his family, was taken into the care of his grandmother, Ellen Gregory, the same woman whose stubborn love had brought Arthur Devereux to the rope. now raised the only Devereux child to survive him. There is a terrible symmetry in that. Beatrice and her twin boys, Laurence and Evelyn, were laid to rest together in Williston New Cemetery in northwest London, the very ground their lives had unfolded around. They lie there still, three among that cemetery's many quiet, terrible secrets, in soil that has witnessed more domestic horror than its plain rows of headstones could ever suggest. Now let me ask you the question that has divided observers of this case for over 100 years. Was Arthur Devereux sane? An alienist, the Edwardian word for a psychiatrist, examined him and pronounced him sane, fit to stand trial and to hang. And yet, consider the sheer, dreamlike folly of it. He committed murder with no real chance of escaping the penalty. He left a trail a child could follow. He knew his mother-in-law would never rest. He knew a trunk of bodies must eventually be found. He even risked orphaning the one person he claimed to love. A truly cold and rational killer, wanting only freedom, would simply have taken Stanley and walked away from his wife. He did not want to leave Beatrice. He wanted her to vanish, to cease, to have existed at all. That is not the logic of a sane man weighing risk. That is the logic of a fantasist who had confused his daydream with the world. The case became a quiet landmark in the long Edwardian argument about poison regulation, about how easily a man in a white apron could turn the tools of healing into instruments of death, and about how thin the partition truly is between respectability and ruin. And so we come back, as we always must, to the trunk. Picture it, an ordinary tin traveling trunk, the kind that sat in 10,000 Edwardian hallways, strapped and padlocked, screwed down tight, its seams painted over with boric acid glue. An object built to carry a life, to hold a family's belongings as they moved hopefully from one address to the next. Arthur Devereux took that emblem of family journeys and made it a coffin. He used the precise skill of his honest trade, the chemist's knowledge of preservation, of suppressing decay and smell, not to heal, but to hide. The ordinary made monstrous. That, I think, is why this case still reaches across more than a century to disturb us. It was not committed by a fiend in the dark. It was committed by a husband, with cough medicine and a packing trunk, in a respectable rented house, by a man his neighbors rather liked. Williston New Cemetery still stands today, half a mile from the bustle of Harleston, its plain paths and weathered rows brushed by foxes and bright green parakeets, walked by people who have no idea what sleeps beneath them. Somewhere among those stones lie a mother and her two small sons, Beatrice Moore Devereux, 30 years old, and the twins, Laurence and Evelyn, who were only 2. Beatrice's dream had been the smallest, gentlest dream there is. A home, a husband who loved her, her children grown safe around her. It would never be realized. The file remains in the archives of the Old Bailey and the yellowed columns of the newspapers, a testament to a betrayal so intimate it still makes the breath catch. The fog has long since lifted from Milton Avenue. The story fades, as all stories do, into the silence of history, but say their names once more before it does. Beatrice, Laurence, Evelyn. They were here. They were loved. They are remembered. Could something like this happen today, a respectable man, a quiet house, a horror sealed away behind a friendly smile? Would we even see it coming? Tell me what you believe in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Soil of Crime, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me which forgotten case you want uncovered next. Because the past is never truly buried. Thank you for being here. This is Soil of Crime, and some shadows never fade.